good turnout. Oh yeah. There's got to be about 300 people.
And I welcome you all this evening to meet the author. I'm Catherine Lenahan, president of the Women's National Republican Club, and I'm so happy, I am so pleased and honored to have the former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, here as our guest speaker and author. Ronnie Pearl, who is the head of our Calvin Coolidge Library Committee, will now introduce Donald Rumsfeld.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I just want to get a little business over with very fast first, before I introduce Mr. Rumsfeld. I would appreciate if all of you would make sure your cell phones are shut off. With all the difficulties and uncertainties our country and the world are going through right now, tonight we have a guest who brings with him a ray of hope. He is a man of reason, great intelligence, logic, common sense, and total and complete dedication to freedom in the United States of America and all over the world. We are so fortunate to have Donald Rumsfeld here tonight. Before I give Donald Rumsfeld the floor, I wish to mention a few things. I begin with the day that I received confirmation of the date for Mr. Rumsfeld to come to our club, with the help of his assistant, Ramley Johnson, who is here with him tonight. I ask, as I always do when I have a book event, could you please send me a bio so I can get a good idea of what... So they did. They sent me a bio, and it was like this big, and little tiny writing of all his achievements. When I received the bio, it was so enormous, filled with so many huge successes in so many different areas that I thought, I can't write all of this in the flyer. There's no way. These are accomplishments of at least 3 great men, all rolled into one. I don't know how he did this, but he did. Tonight I decided to tell you that not only has he achieved success in the public sector and the private sector, but also giving of himself to a wide array of charities. I have to tell you that the list of honors he has gotten, it was so long that I would be here all night telling you that. But there is one in 1997 that I wanted to mention. He was awarded our country's highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Mr. Rumsfeld also chairs the nonprofit Rumsfeld Foundation with his wonderful wife, Joyce, who we are very lucky to have here tonight with us. This organization is a wonderful one, and a lot of people should really get involved in it. I really think everyone should go on the internet and take a look at it. It rewards public service at home and supports the growth of leadership of free economic systems abroad. It does much more than that than I've told you tonight. You may also want to go to his official site, Rumsfeld's Papers, to learn more about his many achievements. I did. I'd have to spend about a year reading it, okay? On September 11th, American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. Mr. Rumsfeld went out to help the rescue operations. He was helping to carry the wounded on stretchers. Talk about an unsung hero. That's what you are. It is now my honor to introduce to you the 13th, and by the way, the youngest U.S. Secretary of Defense ever and the 21st U.S. Secretary of Defense, Mr. Donald Rumsfeld.
Catherine, thank you for your hospitality. Ronnie, I am so glad my wife was here to hear that. Someone asked her one day, how in the world did you stay married to that guy for 59 years? She said he travels a lot. I thought she was kidding. She wasn't. This is a terrific turnout on a difficult evening, and I must say this is a hearty group of people to be here, given all the snow and rain and whatever else is going to happen this evening, which they say is going to be exciting. I am very pleased to be here. This is a terrific organization, and for those of you who are members, I congratulate you and wish you well. I have asked to talk a bit about my book. I wrote my first book, my memoir, Known and Unknown. And I was a friend of Herman Kahn before he passed away, and he used to have a technique where he would take a line across the paper, and he'd write everything he could think about a certain thing. And if he didn't like it, he'd stick it below the line. And if he liked it, but he never gave it away. He always put it below the line. Anything that was still working in his mind, he'd put above the line. I did that to figure out the title of my book. And it's a good technique because you change your mind a little bit and you bring some of those from below the line up above the line and some of those from above the line below the line. I ended up with Known and Unknown because I had said that in a press conference once where I said, there are known knowns, the things you know you know. There are known unknowns, the things you know you don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns, the things you don't know you don't know. Those are the ones that get you. Now, the only other one that was above the line when I picked that one was also one of my favorites, and it was, dogs don't bark at parked cars. Now we do know they do something to parked cars, but that came close to being the title. My mother was a school teacher, and I bet you some of your mothers were school teachers, and you'd ask her, well, what's this word mean? And she'd say, well, look it up, write it down on a card, and keep it at the end of the week. Read it and look at it. I still carry them. I talk about a mother's boy. And look them up, use the word, and I started doing that. And then I started writing down not just words, but thoughts, ideas, concepts. I'd make a mistake and I'd write down that it's better to make original mistakes and not keep making the same old ones over and over. And one day I was in the President Ford came into office, the only man in history who had not been elected president or vice president. He came in when the economy was absolutely the worst it had been since I was born in 1932, which was the depth of the Depression. That was 81 years ago. And he came into office and the economy was terrible, the Vietnam War was coming to a difficult end. There were special prosecutors running around because of the Watergate difficulties. He succeeded the only man who ever had to resign. And I made a comment. He called me back. I was ambassador to NATO, and he called me back from Brussels and asked me to be his chief of staff. And I made a comment. I said something to him. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was something like, it's better to have people working off your outbox than working on your inbox, because it's better to have them working on your priorities rather than you working on their priorities. He said, well, where did you get that? And he'd been a legislator his whole career, and I said, well, I make notes on those things. And he said, well, tell me some of the other ones. And I said, well, when I was a Navy pilot, the handbook said if you're lost, climb, conserve, and confess. Not bad for a politician. There's some folks in the White House who might want to think about that. The concept in business, I spent, I guess, 20 years in business, and one of the ones I always liked the best was what you measure improves. It forces you to decide what you're going to measure, establish a priority, and then it requires you to take a risk, because you have to tell people you're going to measure that. And it may get worse instead of better. And they may not like what you've decided to establish as a priority. In the military, we say the same thing differently. We say, you get what you inspect, not what you expect. I always like Mrs. Thatcher's comment where she said, the only trouble with socialism is pretty soon you run out of other people's money. In any event, President Ford said, give me that to read. So I went back, I said, there's nothing to read, it's just a bunch of notes. And he said, well, have it typed up. So I did, and gave it to him. And he labeled it Rumsfeld's Rules and asked me to give it to the White House staff. Because the staff was in there. He didn't pick the staff, and he wanted them to have a sense of some of the things that I had written down. You know, in Washington, one of the favorite things for people is to say, the phone rings and they say the White House is calling. Now, a trained ape knows that buildings don't make phone calls. It is a human being, and it may very well not be the president. Indeed, it often is not the president. Indeed, most of the time it's not the president. It's some person 8 layers down, but they get a kick out of saying the White House is calling. Another one I wrote down that he liked was, I think it was Shimon Peres I was with, I think in a Chinese restaurant in Tel Aviv with my daughter Marcy. And he said something to we were talking about the Middle East, and he said something to the effect, if a problem has no solution, it's not a problem, but a fact, not to be solved, but to be coped with over time. And if you think about that, there's some truth to it. Dwight Eisenhower said that plans are worthless. Planning is everything. And if you think about that, you have to plan, because it forces you to think of the environment you're going to be functioning in. It forces you to look at alternative courses of action. It forces you to develop a way ahead. But the reality is that in the military, the enemy has a brain. In business, your competition has a brain. And they adapt and adjust. And as they say in the military, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And the same thing in business. It just doesn't. So the plans are worthless, but planning is everything, Eisenhower said. It causes you to invest the time you need to really think things through. One of the things, Frank Gaffney sitting here, who's an expert on national security affairs. And he knows this one. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Nor is it evidence of presence. And you have to know that. You have to understand that. You have to accept that as a thought when you're dealing with intelligence matters. And someone, Mike Hayden, the other day said something to the effect that if it's intelligence, it's not a fact. And that's I'm afraid, the world we're living in. I think it was Russert on Meet the Press who said, he wrote a book about his father's sayings, and I think his father said something to the effect that the world is run by those who show up. You know, it's simple, but it has a certain value. The one I've always liked, I had the I almost said the pleasure, the privilege, the experience is the word I was looking for, of running the war on poverty for Richard Nixon's administration after Sergeant Shriver had departed. And everyone was mad at that program because the mayors were mad, the county commissioners were mad, the governors were furious, Republican and Democrat, it didn't matter. And it was one of those things that reminded me of the saying that beware of ideas that are bold, innovative, and new. I've seen ideas that are bold, innovative, and new that are stupid. And what you really need to do is to try things and then see how they're working, but be willing to measure them. Be willing to take the time to see whether or not it's just an expenditure of effort or whether it's really producing some results. And that's important. I was asked to speak briefly because I'm told that this crowd, all of you, like to ask questions. And I told Ronnie that my wife Joyce may not ask any questions. But if someone asked me my favorite rule, having served in government, it is this. It was from Admiral Hyman Rickover, who served longer as a naval officer, I think, than any man in history. And he said, if you're going to sin, sin against God, because God forgives. Never sin against the bureaucracy. It lies in wait and will get you. So, and I don't think you should let David ask any questions either.
Okay, would everyone like to line up and find the mic?
Not everyone. Anyone wants a question? Yeah.
I wasn't there.
There you go. There you go. Yes, sir.
Bob Lawrence, Southwest Florida. Mr. Rumsfeld, I've stood in front of you many times. Down in Washington.
A little closer to the mic.
Down in Washington, and I think what the Republican Party is looking for is leadership, which we lack today. We lack the wisdom that okay. We lack
As someone back there said, louder and funnier.
We're going to be serious for a minute because the Republican Party has been faltering. We have no leadership. I believe that. We have nobody to compete against the Democratic machine right now, but we do have the wisdom of past individuals that were part of our government. And you're one of those icons. And basically what I'm asking tonight is what wisdom can you give us that things will be all right and decency will be restored to the United States? Can we bring a candidate forward that can accomplish what we need to accomplish?
Well, the short answer is yes. I've lived a third of the history of our country, which is a breathtaking thought. You multiply 81 times, 3 and subtract it from 2014, and you end up right back at the very beginning. It's embarrassing to mention it, but there it is. It's a fact. It tells you how young our country is, or how old I am, or both. Now, I have seen people for decades say that the Democratic Party is dead, or it's never going to be defeated again. I've seen people say the Republican Party's dead, and it's never going to be defeated again. And we go through these ups and downs, and people look at the current situation, and to be sure, the respect of the American people for government is low today. In the case of the Congress, it may be about as low as since they've been taking polls. But maybe it's because I'm from the Midwest that I'm basically optimistic about our country, but I really believe that if you go back, Lyndon Johnson couldn't leave the White House. They had to put buses around the White House to keep people from breaking in. The protests were so violent. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, the city of Washington, D.C. was burning. The whole northeast section was burning. It was in Detroit and Watts, and it was a terrible time in our country's history. We've had presidents that have been shot at or assassinated, since Roosevelt down in Miami and Harry Truman by the Puerto Rican terrorists, and President Reagan and President Ford was shot at. I was standing next to him out in California when that woman, Sarah Jane Moore, pulled the trigger and the bullet went past his head. And we've recovered. And now, to be sure, there has to be a tipping point somewhere. And things, but when things get bad, people tend to get out of their chairs and change their priorities and push the pendulum back and where it belongs, where the country feels better about it. And I think that's our responsibility as individuals. I'm a Republican, but there was that comes as no surprise. But there was a governor from Illinois named Adlai Stevenson who gave a speech at my senior banquet in 1954 at Princeton, where he talked about the citizen's responsibility and the task we have as individuals to help guide and direct the course of this country. And if we are uncomfortable with this country, if we're worried about it, the place to look for the solution is in the mirror. We're the ones who put people in office. We're the ones who made those decisions. We're the ones who are either comfortable with it or uncomfortable with it. And I was at Fort Leavenworth talking to, gosh, I think it was 1,490 majors from all over the country, and probably 10% of them from around the world. And they asked me the question, what worries you the most? And, you know, there's plenty of things you could talk about, Iran or North Korea or proliferation of lethal weapons, terrorism. My answer was, what worries me the most is American weakness. You cannot manage the economy of the United States like Western Europe and model it after that and not expect to end up with a weaker country and send signals out across the globe that the United States is not going to be there, that the United States is not going to have the kind of capabilities that we've had during my adult lifetime. And what happens is, the truth is that weakness is provocative. To the extent you create a vacuum, that vacuum gets filled, and it gets filled by people who do not have the values that our country has, that will not provide the stability and the rib cage in the world, that will not provide the deterrent and the dissuasion that causes people to behave in a way differently. If people see weakness, they take advantage of it. And so my response to you is, we've been through tougher times than this. If Abraham Lincoln had not done what he done, there wouldn't be a United States of America. And the Civil War was, without question, the most god-awful thing that happened in this country. It was a horrible thing. And yet it was a critically important thing. And what we need to do is recognize that things are not good, as you point out. That we can't send signals out of American weakness and not expect the world to become a less stable and a more dangerous place. When I went to Washington out of the Navy in 1957, we were spending 10% of GDP, gross domestic product, on defense. Today we're spending less than 4%. Our allies today are spending less than 2%. Other like-thinking countries in Western Europe. Now, what does that mean? Is it mean we should wring our hands and say, oh, woe is me? No, it means that what we need to do is to belong to organizations like this, to be engaged, to recognize that. Go to my website, rumsfeld.com, and get that Adlai Stevenson speech. He was right between his two defeats by Dwight Eisenhower. And I don't think he would have been a terribly good president. Stevenson, myself, I voted my first time for Eisenhower. But the speech is terrific because it causes you to think about yourself. And so the short answer is, this country is a great country. And it has to be what it can be if the world's going to be a safer place. And the only way it's going to be that way is if the people in this room and people across the country recognize that they can't say, well, it's somebody else's job. It's our job, each of us.
So what you're telling me is that you've given me confidence again, and I believe that we can win the White House. Thank you.
I do indeed.
Mr. Secretary, Brian Reardon from Ramsey, New Jersey. Thank you so much for your coming here and for your service to this country and keeping this country safe.
Thank you.
My question regarding foreign policy in the former Soviet bloc. Upon your departure, we witnessed the conflict in the Republic of Georgia. And today we're seeing borderline civil war in the Ukraine with the people calling for the removal of Viktor Yanukovych. Do you feel that the conflict in the Ukraine is going to be something seen as a border conflict in the former Soviet bloc? And if you were giving Secretary Hagel and Secretary Kerry advice, what would that be?
Well, first of all, truth be told, I'm not.
But if you were?
But Ukraine is an enormously important country. It was leaning west. It's getting tremendous pressure from Russia and Putin's crowd. It is an example of poor diplomacy, in my view. There isn't any reason in the world the way that over the past period of years we couldn't have moved closer and worked more closely with them. And the people from the north in Russia are down in there buying up their media companies. They're down there putting pressure. The oligarchs are buying up important properties. And they continuously put pressure. And the West stands back from Ukraine. And we need to be leaning forward. I can tell you an example of something that's ahead of us, and that's Central Asia. Central Asia is not an entity. It's 5 Central Asian countries and 3 Caucasus, and kind of also Mongolia and Afghanistan, maybe 10 countries with enormous resources, a lot of pressure from Russia, a lot of pressure from China, and it's not even on the radar screen in the United States. I mean, that's something we haven't messed up yet, only because we've not paid any attention. And yet we ought to. It's important. We are an important country, and we need to pay attention to things like that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Joanne Service. Thank you so much for your service, Mr. Secretary. I have a 2-part question.
Oh no, I'm
Yeah,
81 years old.
It could be 5.
It's late at night. Don't give me that 5-part stuff.
I'll do 2. Down to 2.
Let me get my pencil and paper.
Okay. You've handled the shaking hands with Saddam Hussein diplomacy, and you've handled the taking Saddam Hussein out diplomacy, nation building versus containment, and working with dictators. So my first question is, having experienced both, which do you think is more effective for the United States? And my other question is on this whole
No, I'm going to answer that one.
Okay. Okay.
You didn't listen well to me.
Oh, you said you were going to take. Okay. Sorry.
My view, President Reagan's view, when I was Middle East envoy for President Reagan in the country, was that Iraq and Iran were in a war. Iran had seized our embassy people and was hostile, funding terrorism and the like. And the old concept of the enemy of my enemy may not be a friend, but it need not be an enemy. And so President and Secretary Schultz asked me to go over and meet with Saddam Hussein, which I did. And we had no linkage at the time, and we did establish some linkage. Now, he wasn't named the Butcher of Baghdad by accident. He was not someone you'd like to have for dinner. On the other hand, at that moment, it seemed like it was an appropriate thing to attempt to, it was an important country, and Iran was as hostile a nation as any nation can be to the United States. My personal view is that I don't believe we're capable of nation building. I just don't. I think that culture is enormously important, as Pat Moynihan once said. And you have to know the languages, you have to think of their neighbors, not our neighbors. You have to understand their history. And I think that there are things we can do that are important and where we can help a country and give them a hand and create an environment where they can build their own nation. But, the perfect example of doing it, in my view, not very well, is Afghanistan. Our diplomacy in Afghanistan has been pedestrian. It's been embarrassing. We've sent people over there, at least one of those folks I wouldn't hire to push a wheelbarrow, and said things publicly. I like private diplomacy. I think if you have some problem with a person or a government, you sit down with them. Instead, we've been flailing Karzai for days. He's been elected twice by the people. The only thing Karzai can do is react. He has to react politically. And now he's making everything we do more difficult. We don't even have a status of forces agreement in Afghanistan or Iraq. Anyone could get a status. We have status of forces agreements all over the world. And we don't have one in either one of those countries. There's been a failure of diplomacy, and it's serious. We're going to pay a penalty for it, and it's most unfortunate. Now, to answer your question more directly, the first question, and very likely the only question you're going to get. I don't think I'm going to like your second question. You suggested that we had to deal with dictators. I get up in the morning and I look at the world and I take it like it is. It is what it is. There are a handful of countries that are like thinking with us, where they have free political systems, free economic systems, where we have common political interests, common economic interests, and common security interests. Most of the countries of the world are not that way. Now, if you want to be a purist, all you say is, well, I'm only going to deal with the countries that are just like us. And where does that leave you? Then you could even be purer than that. You could say, I'm only going to deal with countries that are just like us, and I'm only going to deal with those countries that are just like us who refuse to deal with countries that aren't just like us. Well, who are you talking to? At the end, you've got 5 countries, 10 countries you're dealing with. You can't live in this world like that. You have to be willing to accept the fact that countries are different. We are different. This country had slaves into the 1800s. Women didn't vote into the 1900s. We aren't what we were 50 or 100 years ago. We're still evolving. They're still evolving. Instead, what we do is we get on our high horse, think we know everything, and tell Musharraf in Pakistan, who helped us enormously after 9/11. Let there be no question about that. And we say to him, oh my goodness, you're going to work in your uniform as an Army officer. We don't go to work in our uniforms in the White House. You should take your uniform off. So he takes his uniform off, and he gets thrown out of office, and you end up with a government that is less friendly, less helpful. We did the same thing in Uzbekistan. I went in and met with Karimov, who's a former Politburo member from the Soviet Union. You know, is he one of us? No. Is he a tough guy? You bet. Was he helpful to us? You bet. Enormously helpful. And he liked the idea of not being under Putin's thumb and having an alternative. And then there was a jailbreak. A bunch of terrorists got loose. Where was it? Frank Ahmadjan? Yeah, I think it was the name of it. And he went in and captured him and threw him back in the slammer. And our State Department didn't like the way he did it. And as a result, we stiffed him, He went right back to Putin, and he had a press conference and said, well, now I know who our friends are. And he threw us off the base. We could no longer support Afghanistan from Uzbekistan. So the question isn't, is somebody like us? Because we're not even like we were. The question is, which way are they moving? If this is good and that's bad, and there's someone over here in the bad half, and he's coming our way, why do we want to stick a stick in his eye? We do it in the name of human rights. But my golly, are human rights better off in Uzbekistan or Pakistan today because we stuck a stick in their eyes? No, they were coming this way. They weren't over here, admittedly. They weren't like us. But by golly, we need to use judgment. We need to, I think the diplomatic record of this administration is absolutely terrible. And if anyone tries to run on it,
But I think, going back to my second question, I think you need.
end of the line.
Yeah, I think that you're right. We can't do nation building, but in order to do the other good things, you have to do the boots on the ground thing as well. Whether it's 10,000 or
Sure, but you have to have a status of forces agreement to be able to do it.
Exactly. But I think that my question is how much. How can you have a war when people turn around and change their mind about it midstream? I mean, how can we ever effectively fight when Democrats can turn around and say the war is a bad idea in the middle of it?
Yeah.
I mean, so that I think is the biggest problem that we face. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, it is a problem. There's no question. And the idea, I think when I left the government, we had something like 23,000 troops in Afghanistan. And they ended up in this administration going over 100,000. But at the same time, before they raised them to that number, they announced they were going to pull them out on a date certain, which tells every terrorist in the world not to worry. Just hang on. Everything's going to be all right. They're going to go. And it's not a good leadership position.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Paul Wiegartner. I have a little bit of a lighter question.
Thank goodness. She wore me out that way.
In one of your earlier answers, you brought up Abraham Lincoln, who I know is a very well-known wrestler. I understand yourself was the captain of the wrestling team at Princeton, is that correct?
True. True.
Can you tell us if that shaped your worldview in any way, or how you view politics?
I wrote a whole chapter in my book about wrestling. And next time I see you, there's going to be a quiz. It does. I mean, there's no question. But I wrestled for 12 years, I think. 4 years in high school, 4 years in college, 3.5 years in the Navy, and then a year after I got out of the Navy training for the Olympics. And it's an interesting sport because you have to, it's like negotiating. You kind of have to anticipate what the other person's going to do. And you have to use leverage. And it's a good sport. I like it. My wife here watched me in high school and was not enamored of this. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Secretary Rumsfeld, first of all, thank you for your service to our country. I think I have a somewhat lighter question, but what I really was wondering, with the long view of history, what do you think are the qualities that make a great president, and who are the presidents you most admire?
Oh, boy. You know, every president comes to that office at a different time, when the demands and pressures are notably different. I've worked with I served in Congress during President Kennedy and Johnson, and I worked closely with President Nixon, President Ford, President Reagan, and President Bush. They all brought different skill sets, and they all arrived at a time when different skill sets were required. And I mean, if you take Gerald Ford, he came in with this basic human decency at a time that the reservoir of trust had been drained in our country. And we were so fortunate that somebody who was that kind of a human being was in that office to refill that reservoir of trust. Ronald Reagan was almost the opposite of President Carter. Someone described President Carter as he went to the Naval Academy, he was obviously intelligent, but they described him as knowing all 9,867 parts of an automobile, but not where he was going. That's a cavalier overstatement, obviously, but he was a micro person. He went right down into the details of things and liked them. President Reagan didn't at all. He kind of plant a standard way out there and say that's where we're going. And then he'd watch everyone to see that they were going in that direction. And then he'd tap them if they get too far off to one side, or tap them back in and herd them in the right direction. And that kind of strategic leadership during his presidency was critically important and made him a perfect person during that period of his service. I think that, it's a funny thing. I remember almost every Republican president I can remember was dismissed as not very quick. Eisenhower, they said, well, he plays too much golf, his syntax isn't very good, and Gerald Ford, they said he played too much football without his helmet, and Tip O'Neill said that Ronald Reagan was an amiable, no, it was Clark Clifford, said that Ronald Reagan was an amiable dunce, and George W. Bush, well, like George Herbert Walker Bush, they said was light. George W. Bush said was all hat and no cattle, or whatever they say about people. Too Western, and I was in meetings with these people, and these people each had, they didn't get there by accident to that office, and the ease with which they were dismissed by the press and the media was unfortunate, because it downplayed their strengths. They're all different. Well, I guess, you have to think of George Washington, who became a model for that office and declined the monarchy and helped set our country on a path. You have to think of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, we literally wouldn't be the United States of America without the courage that he had. I guess Polk pops to mind, because so much of this country of ours came into the Union under the presidency of Polk and the West and the Oregon area. I mean, that is not unimportant, the fact that we are ocean to ocean. And as I say, I give President Gerald Ford, I think he's probably the most underappreciated president because of what he had to do to restore faith in this country. And I think President Reagan has to be elevated up there like that. So, it's a hard thing to do because each one faced a different circumstance, but you have to have respect for the difficulty of that job. It is under a microscope every minute of every day, and a problem in the White House is not just a problem, it's a perfect storm when things go wrong. And so you have to, no matter who's in that office, you have to wish him well and hope that he does well for our country.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Secretary, I'm David Braunschweig, and I want to pay a tribute and ask a question, but you'll find both a bit unusual. The tribute is not this time to your remarkable contribution to our country and to our security, but your contribution to the vitality of this country's economy as a very distinguished executive, entrepreneur, leader of people. As an advisor to you for over 2 years in the private sector, I was a direct witness of that. And I remember in particular you telling us, your advisors, use your imagination. Use your imagination, which was unusual coming from somebody who had the reputation of being a hard-nosed executive.
No, not me.
So I will return the favor, Mr. Secretary. I would like you tonight, to use your imagination with this question. Okay, there's a magic wand and you're back. We're now in the early 2000s. And there are two questions that come to you, which you dealt with at the time, but you're going to need to deal with them again, perhaps in a different way. That's the question. Under your leadership, there was a program called at the time the Joint Strike Fighter, which became the F-35, which over the course of a lifetime, it turns out, will cost this country approximately $1 trillion. Okay. Overruns, miscalculations, poor planning, single source, whatever. Is that something?
Who invited this guy?
Is that something you would do again?
Well, taking a page from President Obama's book, I didn't know anything about it. Oh, goodness. You know, when something, what was it Napoleon said? I think I quoted him in my book here. I've been wrong so many times that I ceased being embarrassed about it. The acquisition process in the Department of Defense, indeed in the government, is broken. It just is. And it's broken in part because the permanent bureaucracy in the Congress, the permanent bureaucracy in the defense community, and the permanent bureaucracy in the Department of Defense. A president comes in and civilian employees, top appointees come in, and they're there briefly and they're gone. And as Rickover said, the bureaucracy is there and it stays there. And the rules are ridiculous in the Defense Department for acquisition. The problems that are imposed are terrible, and it is difficult for the people in the government. They're honorable people trying to do a good job who end up being a party to a process that produces the kinds of overruns that you're talking about. What's the answer? I don't know. I think that I tried to, well, I'll give you an example. I got to the Pentagon and there were 48 presidential appointees to be confirmed by the Senate. I functioned for the first period of months, a non-trivial fraction of my tenure, with none of them there. The process of ethics, the process of FBI, the process of Senate approval, the process of White House approval. I averaged it over 6 years. I functioned with 26% vacancies in those key spots. Now I could walk over and pick up a grand piano with 2 hands and lift 1 leg. But then you say, okay, Rummy, do it with 1 hand. Or do it with 25% less of your fingers. You can't do it. It's hard. I ended up keeping the prior administration's appointees doing those jobs. The other problem is that if you need anything done in the Pentagon, what you do is you go for a military person. Why? Well, you can order them in and order them out. Have them do the job and then have them leave. Or you get a contractor and you hire a contractor and you tell him, here's the job, come in, do it, and when it's over, he leaves. There are hundreds of thousands of civilian employees, and I don't mean to denigrate them. There are a lot of wonderful, talented, fine people. But the fact of the matter is, you can't hire them, you can't fire them, you can't move them from here, you can't move them to there, you can't monitor their work, you can't reward their work. So I said, gee, the CIA has a national security personnel system. Why don't we get one and put it in place in the Pentagon? Well, you know, how many of these P's can you carry on your knife at once? I decided that was a priority. So we worked for more than a year or two. Got it done, got it through the Congress. The unions fought it tooth and nail. We got it through the White House. We put it in place. And I wasn't out of there 2 years before it had been withdrawn. The unions just like a wave taking it out. Now why? Well, I had this crazy idea that we would institute a pay-for-performance system for civilian employees. Can you imagine anything more outrageous or more insulting to the unions there? They didn't like it, and they came up and took it right away, and it's gone. It's disappeared. It has been absolutely neutered.
The magic wand was waved again, and do you repeat old Europe, new Europe today?
Yes. I was asked a question at the Foreign Press Club, and they said that Europe is against President Bush's proposal for something. And I, having lived in Europe and served as ambassador to NATO, and at the time when there were 15 countries in NATO, 14 in the military alliance and 15 in the political alliance, France was out. And by the time they asked me that question, I think we had 26 countries in NATO. All the Eastern European countries had come in, Poland was in. It was an entirely different critical mass. And when they said Europe is against President Bush, the truth was that 6 countries had signed a letter supporting President Bush, I think it was 6, in the Wall Street Journal just the week before. And the only 2 countries that announced against Bush were France and Germany, which are not Europe. They characterized France and Germany as Europe. And I said, gee, that's old Europe. New Europe's got 26 countries in NATO. And the center of gravity shifted. And it was a thoughtful, perceptive comment, if I do say so myself. I'm proud I said it, and I'd say it again. Uh-oh.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for your service to our great country, made certainly greater by people like you finding their way into our government. I'm not in the business of correcting distinguished speakers like yourself.
Did I say something?
Well, we women, we tend to under-exaggerate our age. We tend to say that we're younger than we really are. You, my friend, I know, are a busy guy, but you need to go back and recheck the birth certificate, because I'm not believing the number that you quoted us earlier.
July 9th, 1932.
Check it. Sometimes the writing's wrong. I just want to say, I'm here to pose the second athletic question of the evening. And I'd love if you will indulge me, sir, to take you to a sport requiring slightly more clothing, usually white. Does not require you to roll around or hug men of your own size and age. This is the sport that
It's called riding time. It's not called hugging.
I don't know. I'm spending too much time on the squash courts to know otherwise, so I'm wondering what a military tactician like you, tactical guy like you, can take from the squash court and apply to politics and life and decision making and all the things that you do so beautifully.
Thank you. I love to play squash. I've got 2 titanium hips and a titanium right shoulder, and I play squash right-handed. It's amazing. I wanted all new body parts. They wouldn't do it. The lesson I've learned in squash, I was taught by my wife, Joyce. She said, Don, learn to say good shot. And don't try for it. Yeah. So that's what I do. When I know I can't get it, I used to try. Now I just smile and say good shot. Thank you.
Secretary Rumsfeld, I'm from the state of Iowa originally, which you know is a good wrestling state.
Boy, is it ever.
Yeah, we don't Yeah, my mom was in his wedding party.
Is that right?
Iowa State, I know, Iowa.
Yeah, I've worn, he gave me a sweatsuit once, and I wear it all the time, hoping a little of that guy's skill will rub off on me. What a wrestler he
Well, it
was.
appears that it has. Life so far. But my question is, hopefully not convoluted, but there's been less funding for NASA, and it's like China's going to the moon. Granted, their rover thing lasted like 3 days and died. But what are your thoughts on our investments in technology, whether it be NASA or the military, and especially with drones becoming increasingly popular? Just what are your thoughts on just our continued investment in technology for those areas?
Well, when they fashioned the Constitution, I suppose they had a choice. They could have established a Department of Science and gotten the government involved in science deeply. Instead, they created patent protection. A stroke of genius. I don't know if it was Benjamin Franklin or who, but they established a way that a person could raise money, invest risk capital, create some technology of value, and be rewarded for it for a period of time. And I mean, we talked earlier about the government acquisition process. We probably, if we'd had a Department of Science back in those days, we probably would have been doing it about like we do acquisition in the Defense Department, imperfectly. The difference between the private sector, in fact, I got so unhappy when I was writing this book, Rumsfeld's Rules, during the last campaign. I heard people attacking capitalism, and the occupied people were out, and the defense of capitalism was embarrassingly weak and not well informed, in my view. And so I wrote a chapter on capitalism. Because the idea, we would not have a train or an airplane or a space program without the private sector. And the idea of capitalism, and the idea that is greed, is wrong. Self-interest is not greed. Self-interest is what caused the Wright brothers to spend the money in their bicycle shop and fly, whatever it was, 150 feet or something. It wasn't terribly impressive, but it's been noted. I think that the space program is important. I think that government has a role, but I'm very strongly in favor of the private sector. People spend money, their own money, one way. They spend other people's money differently. And other people's money simply does not get handled or cared for in the same way that people handle their own money. And to the extent we can recognize that and see that they're the kinds, and the difference between government and every other aspect of our society is government can't fail. You go down any retail street in America and go back 6 months later, and 5 or 10% of the stores will be gone. Why? The market changed. Different people came in. Dead leaves die, new leaves grow. And that's a healthy thing. That's a process that is rewarding success. It's rewarding meeting a market. And whereas government can keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again, and the penalty is nothing, because it can't stop. It just goes on. So when you see people talk about the government doing something, I think the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, Tom Curtis was kind of a mentor of mine from Missouri. He was a Republican congressman and one of those people who read bills and thought before he voted. There's only a limited place for people like that in the Congress. But I used to sit with him, and one of the Curtis corollaries was, public money drives out private money. If the government decides to do something, Anyone with an ounce of sense knows that they don't need to step up and do that themselves. Why should they pay for it twice? They're paying for it through their tax dollars, and government's doing that. Therefore, they're not going to do that. And they step away, they back up, because government has filled that area. Not well, but government's filled it. And public money does drive out private money. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, hi, George Bugatti, July 8th, 1967, 11:52 p.m. Almost. In my personal life, I find that transparency, especially when it comes to my wife, is what it takes to be married. In my business, transparency seems to be the key word. Now, this might be asking a magician to reveal his secret, but is there an operational definition of transparency when it comes to government, or is it really is it a misnomer? Is it?
No, I think the people, it's the people's government. It's our government, and we have a right to know generally what's going on in government, and therefore the concept of transparency is sound. I was one of the co-authors, along with John Moss, a Democrat from California, of the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed, gosh, back in the 60s, I think. And it has exemptions for national security issues that ought not to be revealed. But on the other hand, its fundamental is that basically people ought to have access to information. How are you going to make good decisions about government policies or people if you don't have access to the kind of information you need? Now, let's talk about Snowden. Or what's the other, Manning is the other guy who they've been just disgorging all this kind of information.
Manning didn't score at the football.
A different one. I think it's a different one. What's happened, and no one's talking about it really, they're talking about the secrets that were revealed by these people. They'd signed documents saying that they would preserve classified information, they wouldn't reveal information without the approval of the government. They violated it. And everyone's worried about what the information that got out. But there are two other things that are even more important. The information's one thing, but information, that kind of information has a certain lifetime in many respects. What also got out was, by releasing the information, the world knows how we do what we do. They know a lot more about how we do what we do. And that means this enormous investment in technology to develop these capabilities, to gather information. We've now, by the release of that information, not only released the information, we've given people the information as to how they can develop techniques to prevent us from gathering that information using the technologies that we've invested a great deal of money in. Even more important than those two things, what's happened. When I was an ambassador, I could meet with people and develop a relationship. And in the military, we do it, our uniformed people do us, diplomats do it. And you develop a relationship where they develop a confidence level in you, and they tell you something. And they know that if you reveal that information, their jobs, their careers, their families' lives may be at stake. But they develop a confidence level in you, that you will manage that in a way that it will not be revealed that they told you this. That has been compromised. No one with an ounce of sense in the world is going to give confidential information to the representatives of the United States of America, knowing that they're going to feed it back and it's going to potentially be compromised, because their lives will be at risk, their families' lives will be at risk, their careers will be at risk. And that means that the men and women in the United States government today are making political policy decisions based on an absence of the kind of information that we've had the benefit of for decades. Why? Because they know the United States is incapable of keeping a secret. I mean, if I were any leader in Israel and I decided to do something in Iran, and I don't have any idea how any responsible Israeli leader can do anything other than decide to do something if they decide that Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon. I don't see how they can know that. But the last thing they should do is tell us. I mean, we can't keep a secret, and the world knows it. And that means that our diplomats and our military people are making decisions today, and I have not heard anyone even comment on that, because they're doing it in the blind, because we suddenly have dried up the kind of information that is only given if people have confidence in people as professionals. And it is a serious problem.
Sir, thank you for your service, and I think your presence here evokes a certain schadenfreude, a sense of nostalgia for an era lost. And that really leads me to my next question, and that is, how did we arrive at this state where there's a moral inversion in our country? The victim has become the oppressor. In 9/11, the Islamic terrorists are afforded all sorts of rights. They're being tried in the civil system. Major Nadal Hassan is, I think he's, whatever he's doing, he's in the hospital getting artificial limbs probably at this point.
You're referring to the workplace violence?
Yes, yes. And really, I think the most important question and what we could leave here with is if you could answer how we got here and how we can prevail against this, especially this infiltration of Islamists into our government, and why we have this moral weakness and who is culpable for this state that we're in now.
That's a big order.
You'll come back.
This administration and the prior administration have been determined to not be accused of being against a religion. And as a result, there's been an unwillingness to identify the enemy. And if you're not willing to identify the enemy, it's very hard to get all elements of national power and a coalition focusing on that problem. I was uncomfortable with the concept of a war on terror. Once we said it was a war, it kind of sounded like World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and it's much more like the Cold War. It isn't going to end with a signing ceremony on the Missouri. It is something that's going to last not 3 or 4 years, but much more like the Cold War in terms of time. It's also, by using the word war, you sounds like you're going to win it with bullets, and you're not. It's going to be, what if we never said that communism was bad? Now, there were folks I remember running around talking about Euro-communism was not bad. Remember that? That was the good communism. Good grief, what a concept. But you have to be willing to pin the tail on the donkey. You have to say, this is what we're against. And you have to be against the radical Islamists who get up in the morning and are fundamentally opposed to the nation-state concept, the thing that orders the world, nation-states. They're against that. They want to impose a caliphate. Now, if you're not willing to say that, then how in the world can you expect to organize opposition to that? And people are, they're not going to school to learn how to get a job. They're being funded in madrasas to learn how to go out and kill innocent men, women, and children and impose their views on people who don't hold their views, with a total lack of tolerance of anything other than what they're being taught. Now, what do you do about that? It seems to me that people need to be willing to say, does that mean you're against a religion? No, it doesn't mean you're against a religion. Does it mean that you think a majority of the people who believe in that faith subscribe to what the radical Islamists are trying to impose on the world? No, you don't believe that. On the other hand, you do believe that there are people, and anyone who doesn't understand it doesn't get it. There are people every day being funded and trained to kill innocent men, women, and children. And we simply have to acknowledge that fact, not hide from it. I mean, the Attorney General of the United States went up and testified before the Congress. He wouldn't even acknowledge that there was such a word as the words I just used. No, really. I mean, you can't hide from your shadow. It's there. So I guess the first thing I would say in answer to your question is, you simply have to be willing to identify the enemy and be willing to go after him.
Does anyone else have some books to be signed? I've got 5 here. And just a few more minutes we have, okay?
I'm going to catch the 9 o'clock train south before the snow hits all of you. I want you to know that. So if you see me running out of here, it's not fear. It's that I've got an important meeting in Washington in the morning.